On the morning of January 8th, 1943, a maid at the Hotel New Yorker let herself into room 3327. The room was on the 33rd floor. The number was divisible by 3. The man who lived there had insisted on that. He was 86 years old. He had been dead since sometime the previous night. The cause would be recorded as coronary thrombosis. He had died alone, having asked not to be disturbed. Within hours, the room was no longer a place where an old man had died. It was a national security matter. By that afternoon, a young attorney named Irving Duro received a telephone call from Washington. He was told not to close his office. He was told that a man named Nikola Tesla had just died, and that this man was believed to possess a weapon, a beam capable of destroying aircraft in flight. He was told that German agents might already be searching for it. Duro was 31 years old. Until that phone call, he had never heard the name Tesla. Accompanied by 4 men from Naval Intelligence, Army Intelligence, and the FBI, he began moving through Manhattan, hotel by hotel, sealing everything the dead man had owned. Trunks, safes, storage vaults held for a decade against unpaid bills. Later, trying to understand who this man had been, Duro made a phone call of his own to the Westinghouse Corporation. The reaction, he recalled, was ecstatic. They told him that without Tesla, there would have been no Westinghouse. The man in room 3327 had designed the system that delivered electricity to every building in that city. He died owing money for the room he died in. This is how he got there.
Nikola Tesla was born at midnight,
Between the 9th and 10th of July, 1856, in the village of Smiljan, a mountain settlement on the military frontier of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in what is today Croatia. His family were Serbs. His father Milutin was an Orthodox priest. His mother Duka could not read. She had a gift her son would later describe with something close to reverence. She could memorize entire epic poems, thousands of lines, and she built small mechanical devices with her hands. She had never been taught either skill. There were 5 children. The eldest son was Dane, born in 1848, brilliant, favored, and destined for the priesthood. In 1863, Dane was killed by the family's horse. Nikola was 7 years old. He witnessed it. Nothing in the family survived that intact. His father developed a habit of talking to himself, conducting arguments aloud in several different voices. Before his time, people began calling him Old Man Milovan. His mother grieved for the son on whom every hope had rested, and the surviving boy learned something that would shape the next 80 years. Anything I did that was creditable, Tesla wrote decades later, merely caused my parents to feel their loss more keenly. So I grew up with little confidence in myself. He was not a substitute for Dane. He was a reminder. There was something else, and it had begun before the accident. Tesla saw things, not metaphorically. Flashes of light would appear in the air in front of him, so vivid that they blotted out the room. Sometimes they came as images of objects or scenes. Sometimes, as he described it, the air around him was filled with tongues of living flame. They came most often when he was in danger, in distress, or in a state of high excitement. He could not stop them. As a child, he assumed everyone experienced this, and only later understood that no one did. A modern reader will reach for a diagnosis here. Photopsia, a form of synesthesia, perhaps something in the family, his father's voices, his mother's uncanny recall. The historical record does not permit a firm answer, and this account will not pretend otherwise. What can be established is what he did with it. At 12, he read a novel, a Serbian translation of a Hungarian book called Abafi, about a dissolute young nobleman who transforms himself through sheer force of will. Tesla took the lesson literally. He began deliberately training his willpower the way another child might train a muscle. At first, my resolutions faded like snow in April, he wrote, but in a little while, I conquered my weakness and felt a pleasure I never knew before, that of doing as I willed. Then he turned that will on the visions. He had been trying to suppress them. Now he stopped. Instead, he let them run and steered. I began to travel, he wrote, of course in my mind. Every night when alone, I would start on my journeys, see new places, cities and countries, live there, meet people, and make friendships. And, however unbelievable, it is a fact that they were just as dear to me as those in actual life. He had taken a neurological affliction and converted it into a workspace. Later, this would become the strangest and most consequential fact about how Nikola Tesla worked. He did not sketch. He avoided drawings his entire career. Partly, it seems, because he had been so poor at technical drawing in school that his father had to intervene with the authorities to keep him enrolled. He did not need them. He built machines inside the visions, ran them there, and let them wear out in his mind before touching a piece of metal. The other conclusion he drew from watching himself is less often quoted and more revealing. Tesla noticed that every image seemed to be triggered by something external, something he had seen, heard, or touched, sometimes without noticing. Following that thread, he arrived at a position he would hold for the rest of his life, that he possessed no free will at all. He was, in his own words, an automaton endowed with power of movement, which merely responds to external stimuli. A machine, determined entirely by its inputs. A meat machine, as he once put it. He was the son of an Orthodox priest. This view left no room for a soul. There is no record of him discussing it with his father. He was, by any reasonable measure, a strange child. He was terrified of pearls, of women's earrings, of touching another person's hair. He counted his steps and calculated the cubic volume of his food before eating it. Round surfaces caused him physical discomfort. Camphor made him ill in another room. But at the real gymnasium in Gospic, one thing distinguished him. He could perform calculations mentally at speed that other students required paper to attempt. Because he was not calculating, he was watching the answer. There is a small scene from those years worth keeping, because it is the first time we see the pattern that will define his life. The town of Gospic acquired a fire engine. On the day of its public demonstration, the fire brigade paraded to the river in new uniforms, and 16 men began pumping the handles. No water came out. The boy standing in the crowd knew nothing about pumps. He would admit this openly later. His knowledge of the mechanism was nil. He knew next to nothing of air pressure. But he waded into the river, felt along the suction hose, and found it collapsed. He straightened it. Water erupted from the other end. The firemen lifted him onto their shoulders. He was 10 years old, and he had learned two things that he would never unlearn. That he could solve a physical problem by feeling his way into it rather than reasoning about it, and that doing so, in public, made people carry you. He would spend the rest of his life chasing both. At Karlovac, where he was sent to complete his schooling, two things happened. The first was that he saw a demonstration of electricity. His physics professor illustrated lectures with apparatus, and Tesla later described the effect as a kind of conversion. Something about the invisible force moving through the machines held him in a way nothing else had. The second was that his father made his intentions clear. Karlovac was preparation for the seminary. Milutin had lost one son to the priesthood he had planned for him. He did not intend to lose the vocation as well. Tesla said nothing. He simply went on studying physics and dreading his future. In 1873, having finished at Karlovac, he received a strange instruction from his father. Do not come home. Go on a shooting expedition in the mountains instead. This made no sense. Milutin disapproved of hunting. Tesla ignored the message and went home to Gospic and walked directly into a cholera epidemic. That was what his father had been trying to prevent. He collapsed within days. What followed was 9 months in bed. The illness compounded into what he described as dropsy, pulmonary trouble, and all sorts of diseases. At one point his family gave up. A coffin was ordered, and it was there, at the lowest point, that a 17-year-old dying boy made the only successful negotiation of his early life. His father came to his bedside, pale, frightened, urging him to hold on. And Tesla, looking up at him, said, "Perhaps I may get well, if you will let me study engineering." Milutin had already buried one son. He did not hesitate. "You will go to the best technical institution in the world." Tesla recovered. He described it, without much modesty, as coming back to life like another Lazarus. He had won. But note the mechanism by which he won. He had been given what he wanted only because he was dying, and only because his father was terrified of a repetition. Dane's death had bought him his career.
There was one more obstacle.
As a Serb in the Krajina, he was due for 3 years of compulsory service in the Austrian army, and his father, doubting he would survive it, decided he would evade conscription entirely. This was a serious offense. The solution was simply to make the boy disappear. For 9 months from the autumn of 1874, Nikola Tesla vanished into the mountains of Croatia, carrying a hunter's outfit and a bundle of books. He came back physically stronger. He also came back having spent 9 months alone with his visions, unsupervised, and the results are worth recording, because they establish a pattern that will eventually destroy him. He designed a system for shipping mail between continents through an undersea tube propelled by water pressure. He abandoned it after realizing the friction of the pipe walls would defeat him. He then designed a ring around the equator of the Earth. The ring would be held stationary while the planet rotated beneath it. Passengers would ascend, wait for their destination to arrive below, and descend. Travel at 1,000 miles an hour. He conceded it could not be built. He was 18, and already the scale of his ambition had nothing to do with the scale of any problem anyone had asked him to solve. He was not thinking about machines. He was thinking about systems that encompassed the entire planet. Every triumph and every catastrophe of the next 50 years is visible in that ring.
In 1875,
He arrived at the Polytechnic School in Graz on a military frontier scholarship, and for 2 years he was, by any measure, exceptional. He passed 9 exams in his first year, nearly twice the required number. He worked from 3 in the morning until 11 at night, including Sundays. The school wrote to his father to warn him that his son was killing himself with overwork. His father's response is instructive. Milutin did not praise him, he chastised him. And something in Tesla broke loose. Toward the end of his second year, a student from one of the German cultural clubs, irritated that a Serb was outperforming him, tapped Tesla on the shoulder with his cane and told him to go home and warm the chair so the professors could praise him even more. Tesla did not return to his room to study. He went out to prove he could carouse as well as any of them. He learned dominoes, chess. He became, by every account, including Edison's own secretary years later, a genuinely beautiful billiards player. And he discovered cards. To sit down to a game of cards, he said later, was for me the quintessence of pleasure. By the third year at Graz, he had stopped attending lectures. His scholarship was cancelled. University records show he was not registered at all for the spring of 1878. The finest technical institution in the world, the promise extracted from his dying father's fear, was gone. What he did next, he did without telling anyone. In late 1878, he left Graz and moved to Maribor, 185 miles from his family, and took work as a draftsman in a tool and die shop. His evenings were spent in a pub near the railway station called the Happy Peasant. His family did not know where he was. For months, they did not know if he was alive. In January 1879, a former roommate, Kosta Kulisic, happened to pass through Maribor, walked into the Happy Peasant, and found Tesla sitting there playing cards for money. Kulisic was relieved. Tesla had been badly depressed before he disappeared. He asked whether Tesla wanted to come back and finish his degree. Tesla answered coolly. He liked it there. He worked for an engineer, earned 60 forints a month, and could make a little more on each completed project. Kulisic sent word to Gospic. In March, Milutin traveled to Maribor to beg his son to come home, offering to arrange studies in Prague instead. He was most angry about the gambling. To him, a senseless destruction of money and time. And his son told him, "I can stop whenever I please. But is it worthwhile to give up that which I would purchase with the joys of paradise?" Tesla refused to come home. His father returned to Gospic and fell seriously ill. He died the following year. The addiction ended, as most things in Tesla's life ended, abruptly and by an act of will, after his mother confronted him. Her words survive. "The sooner you lose all we possess, the better it will be. I know that you will get over it." His account of what followed is characteristically absolute. "I conquered my passion then and there. I not only vanquished, but tore it from my heart, so as not to leave even a trace of desire." He never gambled again. This is the man who will shortly arrive in New York with 4 cents in his pocket, capable of total self-control, and only in violent, all-or-nothing acts. He could not moderate anything. He could only annihilate it or surrender to it entirely. He was about to apply that temperament to the electrification of the world. He arrived in Budapest in January 1881, having heard that a telephone exchange was being built there under license from Thomas Edison. The job he wanted did not exist yet. Instead, he was hired as a draftsman at the Central Telegraph Office of the Hungarian government, on $5 a week, extracting square and cube roots for the public benefit. He was 24, and it was the sort of work that fills a day and empties a life. He quit, intending to support himself by inventing. Novice inventors have been making this decision for 200 years. It rarely works. It did not work for Tesla. The inventions came, their value, as one account of the period put it, was visible only to the eye of faith. And then he collapsed. He described it as a complete breakdown of the nerves. What he described next is harder to categorize. His pulse, he claimed, ranged from a few beats a minute to over 260. He could hear a watch ticking 3 rooms away. A fly landing on a table produced a dull thud in his ear. Carriages passing several miles off shook his body. The ground under his feet trembled continuously. In order to sleep, he needed rubber cushions placed under the legs of his bed. Ordinary speech sounded like thunder. Sunlight was unbearable. In the dark, he said, he could sense an object at 12 feet by a peculiar creeping sensation in his forehead. A physician who examined him called it unique and pronounced it incurable. Tesla was convinced he was going to die. Take from this whatever you find credible. He was writing it down nearly 40 years later, and he was, by then, a man with a long practice of describing himself in superlatives. What is not in dispute is that a young engineer in Budapest in 1881 became so ill he could not work, and that the illness had something to do with sensation itself. He was saved by a man named Anthony Szigeti. Tesla's description of him is unkind and affectionate at once. A large head with an awful lump on one side, a sallow complexion distinctly ugly, and from the neck down, a body that might have served for a statue of Apollo. Szigeti was one of the strongest men in Hungary. He physically dragged Tesla out of his room and forced him to exercise. "He saved my life," Tesla wrote. Szigeti was also interested in electricity, and in the evenings, the two of them walked in the Városliget, the city park, discussing the problem that had occupied Tesla since Graz, the alternating current motor that everyone agreed was impossible. And so we come to the most famous scene in the life of Nikola Tesla. By his own account, written in 1919, it happened on an afternoon in that park, at sunset. He was reciting Goethe's Faust from memory. He knew entire books by heart, word for word, and had reached the passage where the poet watches the sun go down. The glow retreats, done is the day of toil, it yonder hastes, new fields of life exploring. Ah, that no wing can lift me from the soil, upon its track to follow, soaring. As he spoke the words, he said, the idea came like a flash of lightning, and in an instant the truth was revealed. He picked up a stick and drew diagrams in the sand, the same diagrams he would present 6 years later to the American Institute of Electrical Engineers. He said his friend understood them perfectly. And then, according to Tesla, he said to Szigeti, "See my motor here? Watch me reverse it. Not imagine, not suppose, see it." The images, he wrote, had the solidity of metal and stone. I cannot begin to describe my emotions. The idea itself is genuinely elegant and worth understanding, because everything that follows depends on it. Every motor before this had a problem. To make the rotating part turn, you had to deliver electricity to the rotating part, which meant brushes and commutators, physical contacts scraping against a spinning surface, sparking, wearing out, failing. Tesla's insight was that you do not have to touch the rotor at all. If you arrange stationary coils around it and feed them alternating currents, timed out of step with one another, the magnetic field itself will rotate. And a rotating magnetic field will drag a metal rotor around with it, without a single physical connection, without brushes, without sparks. The field turns, the metal follows. Those were Goethe's invisible wings, currents induced in the rotor by nothing but a field in the air. He was 26, and he had done it with no laboratory, no apparatus, and no drawings, inside the same visual system that had once filled his childhood with tongues of flame. Now, the part usually left out. That account was written in 1919, 37 years after the event, in an autobiography intended for a popular magazine. In 1903, under oath, in patent testimony, where the date of invention had enormous legal value, Tesla said nothing about a eureka moment in the park. Nothing about Goethe, nothing about the sunset, nothing about the stick in the sand. His sworn testimony suggests instead that the ideas came to him gradually, worked out over time, and continued to be worked out through experiments in 1883 and 1887. This matters, and not because it makes him a liar. Establishing an early, dramatic, precisely dated moment of invention would have been legally advantageous in 1903. He had every incentive to tell that story under oath. He did not tell it. He told it later, to the public, when the audience was no longer a court, but a readership. What the historical record supports is this. Something significant did happen to Tesla in Budapest. He arrived without a solution and left with the core of one. The rest, the poetry, the lightning flash, the perfect diagram in the sand, belongs to a second act of creation, performed decades afterward by a man who had learned by then exactly how to make himself into a legend. He was extraordinarily good at that. It is one of the reasons we are still talking about him. It is also one of the reasons it is so difficult to say what he actually did. He landed at Castle Garden, Manhattan, in the summer of 1884. He was 28 years old. According to the standard account, he had 4 cents in his pocket, a few of his own poems, some calculations for a flying machine, and a letter of introduction. The letter is the part everyone remembers. It was addressed to Thomas Edison, and it said, "I know 2 great men, and you are one of them. The other is this young man." It is a wonderful line. It has been quoted in every account of Tesla's life for a century, including O'Neill's, which attributes it to Charles Batchelor, Edison's closest associate. Carlson's research indicates it was more likely written by Tivadar Pushkas. Batchelor had already returned to New York by then. A small correction, but worth making, because it is characteristic of this story. Almost every famous detail has a slightly different shape once you look underneath it. Edison hired him. The 2 men could not have been less alike, and the difference was not personal. It was epistemological. Edison was an empiricist of legendary stamina. He solved problems by trying things, thousands of things, systematically until something worked. He famously dismissed theory. He was, in the most literal sense, a man who found answers with his hands. Tesla had spent his entire life finding answers by closing his eyes. They were both extraordinary. They were incompatible. Tesla was set to work redesigning the Edison dynamos, the long-legged machines the shop called Mary Ann's. He replaced their long magnets with shorter, more efficient cores. He claimed the improved machines produced 3 times the output for the same amount of iron. His hours at the Edison Machine Works were, by his own account, from 10:30 in the morning until 5 o'clock the following morning. Edison, who slept in fragments and worked 75 hours at a stretch when something interested him, is said to have remarked that he had had many hard-working assistants, but that Tesla took the prize. Then comes the incident. The versions differ, and the difference matters. In O'Neill's telling, the 1944 biography written by a friend, Edison challenges Tesla to redesign 24 dynamos, a full year's work, and says, "There's $50,000 in it for you if you can do it." Tesla does it. He completes the redesign. And when he asks to be paid, Edison laughs and tells him, "Tesla, you don't understand our American humor. $50,000 in 1885 is somewhere over $1 million in modern money." Tesla resigned immediately. Cypher's account preserves a slightly different version drawn from Tesla's own words, in which it is the manager who promised the 50,000, and Edison who delivers the punchline, "You are still a Parisian. When you become a full-fledged American, you will appreciate an American joke." There is no surviving contract. There is no documentary record of the promise. There is Tesla's account, given years later, and there is Edison's silence. So, was Edison a thief? This is the question the internet has answered loudly, and, on the whole, badly. Let us be precise about what can be established. Edison ran a laboratory in which improvements made by employees belonged to the company. That was not a betrayal. That was and remains how industrial research works. A promise of $50,000 to a recently hired foreign engineer would have been extraordinary, which is either evidence that Edison never made it or evidence of how badly he wanted those dynamos. What is undisputed is that Tesla did the work, was not paid what he believed he had been promised, and walked out. He was offered a raise, $10 a week on top of his 18. He refused it and left. And for the following year, the winter of 1886 into 1887, Nikola Tesla dug ditches in New York City for $2 a day. The man who had redesigned Edison's dynamos spent a winter with a shovel. He said later that his education in various branches of science, mechanics, and literature seemed to him like a mockery. There is a temptation here to make Edison the villain and Tesla the martyr, and to leave it there. Resist it. The truth is stranger and considerably more useful. Edison did not destroy Tesla. Edison employed him at a moment when he was unknown and gave him the American credential that made everything afterward possible. When Tesla later raised capital, the first fact investors were told was that he had worked for Edison. And the man digging ditches was not doing so because Edison had ruined him. He was doing so because he had refused a raise on principle, the same absolutism that had once made him tear gambling out of his heart with no trace of desire left behind. He could not compromise. It was his greatest strength as an inventor and the mechanism by which he would eventually lose everything. But there was one more consequence, and it is the one that changed the world. While digging, Tesla talked to his foreman about the motor in his head, the one from the park in Budapest. The foreman knew someone. That contact led to others, and by April 1887, Tesla had investors, a laboratory at 89 Liberty Street, and his own company. Within a year, he would file the patents for the polyphase alternating current system. Within 2, Westinghouse would buy them, and the war would begin. In May 1888, Tesla delivered a lecture to the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, titled "A New System of Alternate Current Motors and Transformers." He had a laboratory now on Liberty Street, backed by 2 investors, Charles Peck and Alfred Brown, who had spent the previous year teaching him something he had never possessed, a business strategy. Patent, promote, sell. It worked immediately. George Westinghouse, the Pittsburgh industrialist who had bet his company on alternating current, understood at once what he was looking at. AC could be transmitted across long distances cheaply, which was its enormous advantage over Edison's direct current. But AC could not run a motor, and without motors, electricity was only lighting. It could not turn factories, streetcars, machinery. It was half a technology. Tesla's polyphase system was the missing half. The negotiation was handled by Peck, who had previously sold a telegraph company to Jay Gould and knew exactly how to bluff. He informed the Westinghouse men that a San Francisco capitalist had already offered $200,000 plus a royalty of $2.50 per horsepower on every motor installed. The Westinghouse representative wrote back to his employer that the terms were monstrous and that there was no possibility of considering them seriously. On the 7th of July, 1888, Westinghouse bought the patents, $25,000 in cash, $50,000 in notes, and a royalty of $2.50 per horsepower, guaranteed to rise to $15,000 a year. That royalty clause is the single most consequential sentence in Tesla's financial life. Remember it. The war that followed was not a scientific dispute. It was a commercial extermination campaign, and Edison fought it the way a threatened incumbent fights. The strategy was elegant and vicious. Make the public believe alternating current kills. An electrical engineer named Harold Brown, working with Edison's tacit and eventually explicit support, began staging public demonstrations. He electrocuted stray dogs with alternating current before audiences of reporters and physicians at Columbia College. When critics objected that killing a dog proved nothing about a man, Brown moved on to larger animals, calves and a horse, in a brightly lit room at Edison's own laboratory complex at West Orange in December 1888. Edison attended personally. His presence imbued the proceedings with legitimacy and an inevitable glamour. New York State had recently voted to replace hanging with electrocution, on the argument that the rope was a relic of barbarism. The question remaining was which current the state would use to kill. Brown campaigned relentlessly for alternating current. The Medico-Legal Society voted for it. Brown was then hired by the New York State prison system to design the apparatus, guaranteeing that the machines used would be Westinghouse machines. He acquired them second-hand through intermediaries, because Westinghouse would not have sold them for this purpose. Edison's camp promoted a new verb for what the chair did to a man: to be Westinghoused. On the 6th of August, 1890, William Kemmler, convicted of murdering his common-law wife with a hatchet in Buffalo, became the first man executed by electricity. It was botched. The first jolt did not kill him. He was found still breathing, and the current had to be applied again. Witnesses reported burning, smoke, the smell of it. Newspapers described it as an awful spectacle, far worse than hanging. Westinghouse, hearing of it, said they would have done better with an axe. Kemmler had been killed with Westinghouse equipment in a chair designed by Edison's man, using the current Edison wanted the public to fear. And it did not work. Not commercially. Within 3 years, alternating current won the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The Westinghouse bid to light the entire fair came in dramatically under Edison's, and then won Niagara Falls, the prize that decided everything. The system now delivering electricity to the building you are in is Tesla's. But by the time Chicago happened, Tesla no longer had his royalty. In 1890 and 1891, Westinghouse was in serious financial trouble. He had expanded aggressively, the market had turned, and his bankers moved to reorganize the company. According to O'Neill's 1944 account, the financiers made one condition explicit. To keep control of his own firm, Westinghouse had to terminate the Tesla contract and eliminate those royalty payments, payments that would eventually have run into millions. Westinghouse went to Tesla and asked, and Tesla, in the version told for 80 years, tore up the contract on the spot. A grand gesture, loyalty to the one man who had believed in him. He destroyed the paper that would have made him one of the richest men in America. It is the most famous act of his life, and it is almost certainly not what happened. Here is where the biographers separate and where the arithmetic matters. Carlson checked the numbers. Under the 1888 contract, the total royalty Westinghouse would have owed by 1891 was roughly $105,000, of which Tesla's share was about $47,000. Westinghouse had sold very few motors because his own engineers had not yet solved the technical problems with them. There were only a handful of AC systems in existence capable of using them at all. In other words, in early 1891, nobody, not Westinghouse, not the bankers, had any reason to believe those royalties would ever amount to millions. That figure is a retrospective calculation, made possible only by knowing how completely AC would go on to win. Cipher describes something different from a grand renunciation, a negotiation. Tesla agreed to give up the royalty clause in exchange for a commitment that Westinghouse would put his engineers back to work on the motor, which had stalled, and honor the scheduled payments. Tesla's fear was not poverty. It was that his system would be abandoned, unfinished. So the truth appears to be this. He did give up the clause. It did cost him an enormous fortune, but only in hindsight, and only because the technology succeeded beyond anyone's projection at the time. He was not making a saintly sacrifice of known millions. He was making a calculated trade to keep his invention alive at a moment when it was still failing. That is a less romantic story. It is also a story about a man who consistently chose the survival of his ideas over his own security, and who did so again and again until there was nothing left. The gesture was real. The martyrdom was manufactured later, partly by his biographers and partly, as usual, by him.
By the early 1890s,
Nikola Tesla was famous in a way that no engineer had been before him. Not respected, not merely successful, famous, in the specific modern sense of being a personality that newspapers sold copies by describing. The transformation happened in his laboratory at 3335 South Fifth Avenue, and it happened because he understood something that most of his colleagues did not, that electricity, in 1893, was still magic to the public, and that a man who could perform magic could command attention, and attention could be converted into capital. He was not a scientist who happened to be theatrical. He was deliberate about it. The demonstrations were extraordinary. He would stand before an audience holding a glass tube with no wires attached to anything, and it would blaze with light. He passed hundreds of thousands of volts through his own body at high frequency, so that the current traveled along the surface of his skin without harming him, and stood wreathed in a halo of visible discharge, a man on fire, calmly explaining what was happening. He lit lamps held by members of the audience. He made metal eggs spin upright on tables through invisible rotating fields. The demonstration he called the Egg of Columbus, which was in fact a live illustration of exactly the principle he had first seen in the park in Budapest. He was tall, extremely thin, immaculately dressed, and he spoke 8 languages. He had a slight accent, a formal manner, and enormous hands. He looked, in short, precisely like what the age wanted a wizard to look like, and he knew it.
his social life
Became a project in itself. He dined regularly at Delmonico's on Madison Square, the hub of New York society, where the old aristocracy ate alongside Wall Street money. He joined the Players Club. He gave private demonstrations in his laboratory for people who could not have followed the physics and did not need to. The point was the spectacle, and the spectacle bought him access. He became friends with Mark Twain. There is something quietly moving in this, if you remember part 1. As a boy in Croatia, recovering from the illness that nearly killed him, Tesla had been sent uncatalogued books by the local library, and among them were novels by Mark Twain. He said later that they were so captivating that they made him forget his hopeless state. 30 years later, Twain was standing in his laboratory in New York, and there is a photograph of it. Twain holding one of Tesla's glowing tubes, delighted. Tesla also persuaded Twain to try his mechanical oscillator, a vibrating platform he believed had therapeutic value. Twain, enthusiastic, stood on it and refused to get off despite Tesla's warnings. The oscillator's effect on the digestive system was rapid and comprehensive. Twain had to be helped urgently to the bathroom. The story is usually told as a joke. It is also a fair summary of the man, a genuine insight into vibration applied with no sense of proportion whatever to a beloved friend. In 1893, at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Westinghouse and Tesla lit the fair with alternating current. Nearly 100,000 incandescent lamps, more electric light in one place than had ever existed. 27 million people came. It settled the war of the currents in public perception before it was settled in the market. Tesla had his own exhibit, and he ended his demonstrations by passing current through his body until light poured off him. 2 years later, Niagara Falls was harnessed using his polyphase system. The generators bore his patent numbers. It was, by any measure, complete vindication. The boy who had told his uncle he would one day capture the falls had done exactly that 30 years later, as he said he would. He was 39 years old, world famous, and at the height of his powers. On the 13th of March, 1895, at around 2 in the morning, a fire broke out in the building on South Fifth Avenue. The laboratory was on the 4th floor. The floor collapsed. Everything he owned, instruments, notes, models, the accumulated apparatus of a decade, fell through the building and was destroyed. He was not insured. The losses were not only financial. Tesla worked by holding designs in his head and building them once. The physical record of his work between 1889 and 1895 was almost entirely in that room. Years of high-frequency research, oscillator designs, and, by his later account, early experiments in wireless transmission went with it. Reports describe him the following morning as unable to speak. He was, by then, one of the most celebrated men in America. Within a day, he was a man standing in the street, looking at a burnt building. Edward Dean Adams, the financier behind the Niagara project, extended him credit. He rebuilt on Houston Street. Within a year, he was working again. But something had changed, and the trajectory from this point runs downward, slowly at first. Here, it is worth pausing on the pattern because we are at the exact midpoint of his life, and the two halves are structured identically. Everything before 1895 he built by moving toward a defined problem. Make a motor that works without brushes. Make a system that transmits power over distance. Concrete, bounded, solvable. Everything after 1895 he built by moving toward an image. Transmit power without wires to the entire planet for free. That is the equatorial ring again. It is the 18-year-old in the Croatian mountains designing a structure around the whole Earth. And the terrible detail is that the second ambition was not delusional. Wireless transmission of signals was entirely possible. He was among the first to grasp it, and had he pursued only that, he might have owned radio outright. What made it fatal was that he would not separate the achievable from the ideal. He wanted the whole system, perfect, at global scale, on the first attempt. He was about to go to Colorado and then to Long Island to build it. In May 1899, Tesla left New York for Colorado Springs at an altitude of 6,000 feet, where the summer thunderstorms are among the most violent in North America, and the air is thin enough to conduct at lower voltages. He had been offered free electricity by the local power company and free land. He built a wooden barn on the prairie with a retractable roof and a mast rising 200 feet above it, and inside he built the largest electrical apparatus that had ever existed. He called it a magnifying transmitter. He was there for 9 months. It was, by a considerable margin, the most productive and the most disastrous period of his life. The purpose was not spectacle, whatever the photographs suggest. Tesla had convinced himself of a specific physical proposition, that the Earth itself is a conductor, that it can be made to resonate electrically like a bell, and that if you pump energy into it at exactly the right frequency, you can set up standing waves in the planet, and then draw that energy out anywhere on its surface. No wires, no cables, no transmission lines. Power delivered through the ground to anyone with a receiver anywhere on Earth. If that were true, it would be the single greatest technological achievement in human history. He went to Colorado to prove it. The results were extraordinary in the literal sense. In New York, he had reached 3 million volts and produced discharges 16 feet long. In Colorado, he was aiming for 50 million volts and bolts of artificial lightning between 50 and 100 feet. The photographs from that barn are still astonishing. The most famous shows Tesla seated calmly in a chair, reading a book, while enormous branching discharges fill the room around him. It is a double exposure. He posed for it separately. He said so himself. It was made, in his words, for the purpose of showing the effect in the most striking way. He was a superb photographer of his own myth. On the popular figure, the claim that Tesla produced a bolt of lightning 135 feet long, heard 15 miles away, Carlson notes something worth recording precisely. He went looking for the source. The longest streamer Tesla himself records in his Colorado Springs notes is considerably shorter in an entry from the last day of 1899. Carlson states plainly that he has not been able to find any reference to 135 feet in Tesla's own documentation. The figure is everywhere. It appears in nearly every account. It does not appear in the notebook. What is not in dispute is what happened to the town. Running the transmitter at full power, Tesla drew so much current that he destroyed the generator at the El Paso Electric Company's plant. The station caught fire. Colorado Springs went dark. He had blacked out an entire city to run an experiment. The power company was not amused and required him to pay for repairs. The relationship never recovered. Then there is the other thing that happened in that barn. One night, working with an extremely sensitive receiver while a storm moved away across the plains, Tesla detected a rhythmic series of signals, regular, repeating, in a pattern he could not attribute to any natural source he knew. He concluded, over the following year, that they were not terrestrial in origin. In January 1901, he announced this in a letter to the American Red Cross. He was careful in his phrasing. He said extraterrestrial. He did not say Mars. The newspapers said Mars. They said it because the culture was primed for it. Schiaparelli had mapped what he called canali on the Martian surface. Percival Lowell had built an observatory in Arizona specifically to study them and had published a book in 1895 arguing that Mars was a dying world whose inhabitants had built irrigation canals to survive. Tesla, hearing rhythmic pulses in a Colorado barn, stepped directly into the most fashionable delusion of his age. The scientific establishment turned on him. Hard. What did he actually hear? Nobody knows, and the honest answer is that the notebooks do not tell us. There is no mention of the extraterrestrial signals in his Colorado notes at all. The candidates that have been proposed since include Marconi's early transmissions, natural terrestrial radio phenomena, and, in an analysis by the Coram brothers, emissions from Jupiter's moon Io, which does produce signals in the range Tesla's receiver was operating in. That last possibility is genuinely remarkable. If it is correct, Tesla may have been the first human being to detect a radio signal from another world. He simply drew the wrong conclusion about who was sending it. But the important thing about Colorado is not the lightning or the Martians. It is a shift in how he was reasoning. Carlson makes an observation here that is worth quoting nearly in full because it explains everything that happens afterward. Tesla believed, from his orthodox upbringing, from his lifelong method, that if he could clearly conceive an ideal, it must be true. He had done exactly this with the rotating magnetic field, seen it in his mind, and found it real. So when he imagined transmitting power through the Earth, he believed it must be real, because it was a product of the same mind. Carlson compares him to John Nash. Asked how a rational mathematician could believe extraterrestrials were sending him messages, Nash answered, "The ideas I had about supernatural beings came to me the same way that my mathematical ideas did, so I took them seriously." That is the whole tragedy in one sentence. The visionary faculty that had produced the AC motor could not distinguish between a true insight and a false one. It felt the same from the inside. He left Colorado in January 1900, convinced he had proved the Earth's resonance and that global wireless power was now an engineering problem rather than a scientific one. He was wrong, and he was about to spend the last, best money he would ever have proving it. In June 1900, Tesla published an article in the Century magazine called "The Problem of Increasing Human Energy." It was illustrated with the Colorado photographs. It was enormously long, philosophically grandiose, and it worked exactly as intended. It reached J. Pierpont Morgan. Morgan was the most powerful financier in the world. He had recently created U.S. Steel. He controlled railroads, banks, and, through Edison General Electric, a substantial part of the American electrical industry. Tesla went to see him at his home on Madison Avenue and made a pitch. The pitch was this: wireless telegraphy, a system that would send messages across the Atlantic without cables, breaking the monopoly of the undersea telegraph companies, which Morgan understood immediately as a business. Morgan agreed to invest $150,000 in exchange for 51% of the patents. And there is the problem, and it is not a small one. Tesla did not want to build a telegraph system. He wanted to build the global wireless power transmitter he had convinced himself was possible in Colorado. He took Morgan's money for one purpose, intending, from the start, to use it for another. He said so himself later in writing. He told Morgan that the wireless power system had been his intention all along. Morgan had bought a telegraph company. Tesla was building a planetary utility on a budget calculated for something far smaller. Construction began at Shoreham, Long Island, on 200 acres provided by a lawyer named James Warden. Tesla called the site Wardenclyffe. Stanford White, the most fashionable architect in America, designed the brick laboratory. and rising above it, the tower, a wooden lattice structure 187 feet high, topped with a 55-ton steel dome with an iron shaft driven 300 feet into the ground beneath it. The ground connection mattered enormously to Tesla. The energy was to be pumped into the Earth itself. As he put it, the current had to grip the Earth. Then, in December 1901, while the tower was still under construction, the news came from Newfoundland.
Guglielmo Marconi,
Using an aerial suspended from a kite in a winter storm at St. John's, reported hearing 3 faint dots, the letter S in Morse code, transmitted from Poldhu in Cornwall, 2,000 miles away. He had crossed the Atlantic. The claim was thin. There were no independent witnesses, only Marconi and his assistant Kemp heard the signal. Scientists asked, reasonably, how waves traveling in straight lines could follow the curvature of the Earth. Lee de Forest wrote acidly in his diary that whether the 3 dots came from England or, like those Tesla heard, from Mars, there would be no more transatlantic messages for some time. It did not matter. The story ran on the front pages, and Marconi became the man who invented radio. The following month, the American Institute of Electrical Engineers held a dinner in his honor at the Waldorf Astoria. The menu was printed with sketches of Marconi's antennas. Lamps, strung across the ballroom, flashed the 3 dots throughout the meal. Tesla lived in the Waldorf. He left town rather than attend. A letter from him was read aloud, congratulating Marconi, while pointedly declining to mention that any message had crossed the ocean. And then Michael Pupin of Columbia stood up and, without naming him, dismantled him in public. I also heard a man say, "Years ago I thought of transmitting wireless signals by the wobbling of the charge of the Earth." Well, any one of us can think of schemes like that. But how about the engineering side of it? I said to this man, "Give me an engineering specification of your apparatus, and then I will believe you, not before." It was a fair criticism delivered with a knife. Tesla now had to go back to Morgan and explain that the man he had promised to beat had already won, and that he needed more money. His letters to Morgan over the following years are difficult to read. He argued that transmitting power was far more important than sending a few short messages. He revealed the true scale of his ambition. He asked, then pleaded. Morgan's answer was consistent and final. He had made an agreement for a specific sum. He would not add to it. Morgan was not being cruel. He had been sold a telegraph business, discovered he was funding something else entirely, and declined to keep paying for it. Any investor would have done the same. Tesla, meanwhile, was doing what he had done at Graz, pursuing a thing absolutely, unable to scale down, unable to deliver a small version first. The tower was never completed. The equipment was never fully installed. The system was never tested at power. By 1905, the money was gone, the staff dismissed. Tesla's manager, George Scherf, stayed on partly out of loyalty, at reduced pay. Tesla mortgaged Wardenclyffe to the Waldorf Astoria to cover his hotel bill. In 1917, the tower was dynamited. The scrap was sold to help settle the debt. He suffered a nervous breakdown around 1905. He was 49. There is a passage in Carlson worth remembering here because it strips away the conspiracy narrative that has grown over this site. The usual story is that Morgan destroyed Tesla to protect his investments in copper and cable, that free energy was suppressed by capital. The documents show something plainer and sadder. A man who could not tell an investor what he was actually building, who could not produce an intermediate result, and who ran out of money, attempting to complete a planetary system in a single step. The physics, for what it is worth, does not appear to have been on his side either. Wireless power transmission at that scale, by that method, has never been made to work by anyone since, and not for lack of trying. What Wardenclyffe actually was, in the end, was an 18-year-old's ring around the equator, rendered in brick and steel on Long Island, and abandoned unfinished when the money ran out.
He lived another 38 years after Wardenclyffe failed.
That is the fact most accounts hurry past because it does not fit the shape of a tragedy. He did not die broken at 50. He went on and on in hotel rooms in Manhattan for nearly 4 decades. He kept inventing. Some of it was real. A bladeless turbine he considered among his finest work, and which he could never get manufactured. Early work on radio-controlled machines that anticipated drones by a century. He gave interviews, he held court, but he never again built anything that changed the world, and he was never again solvent. The pattern of his later life was hotels. He would take rooms at a good address, the Waldorf Astoria, the St. Regis, the Governor Clinton, finally the New Yorker, accumulate a bill he could not pay, and move on when the management lost patience. At the Waldorf, where he had lived for 20 years, the bill eventually reached nearly $19,000. He surrendered the deed to Wardenclyffe to settle it. That is how the tower came to be owned by a hotel and eventually dynamited for scrap. There were complaints in every hotel, and they were always about the same thing: the pigeons.
He fed them daily.
He particularly liked the birds in Bryant Park, behind the New York Public Library, a corner of which is now officially named for him. In 1917, when the AIEE finally awarded him the Edison Medal, he vanished minutes before the ceremony. His colleague Berend searched the building in a panic and eventually found him across the street in Bryant Park, feeding pigeons. When he had finished, Tesla walked calmly to the hall and delivered an inspiring speech about his early life. He brought injured birds back to his rooms and nursed them. He kept them in cages, on windowsills, in baskets. Maids complained about the droppings. Managers complained about the smell. He moved hotels. And then there is the passage that every biographer includes, because there is no way to write about this man honestly and leave it out. He described one bird, a white female pigeon, that he said came to him regularly. "I loved that pigeon as a man loves a woman, and she loved me. As long as I had her, there was purpose to my life." He said that one night she came to him, and that light poured from her eyes, and that he understood she was dying. He said that when she died, something went out of his life, and that he knew his life's work was finished. He never married. He said repeatedly and consistently across 60 years that marriage and love interfered with the work. He appears to have meant it. He was a man of enormous formality, immaculate dress, and 8 languages, who at the end could not bear to be touched by a human being and was undone by the death of a bird. The obsessions had hardened into a system by then. Everything had to be divisible by 3. He circled a building 3 times before entering. He required exactly 18 napkins at dinner and used them to polish already clean silver and glassware. He calculated the cubic volume of soup before eating it. He could not tolerate pearls or round objects or the touch of another person's hair. His hotel room numbers were divisible by 3. Room 207 at the Governor Clinton, room 3327 at the New Yorker. In modern terms, this is severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. In 1930, it was simply the eccentricity of a famous old man, and it made excellent copy.
Which brings us to the birthday interviews.
Every year, on the 10th of July, Tesla held a press conference. Reporters came because he could be relied upon to say something extraordinary, and he never disappointed them. He announced a way to transmit energy to other planets. He announced a device to photograph thought. He announced that he had received a Nobel Prize, which he had not. He announced that he could split the Earth like an apple. And in 1934, at the age of 78, he announced the weapon. The press called it the death ray. Tesla hated the term and corrected it constantly. In a paper titled The New Art of Projecting Concentrated, Non-Dispersive Energy Through Natural Media, a document that surfaced in 1984 and was authenticated by the Tesla Museum in Belgrade, he described something more specific: a system for accelerating minute particles of tungsten or mercury to enormous velocity. "I want to state explicitly," he wrote, "that this invention of mine does not contemplate the use of any so-called death rays. Rays are not applicable because they cannot be produced in requisite quantities and diminish rapidly in intensity with distance." He said it would end war, that it would surround every nation with an invisible wall, making attack impossible. He offered it to the United States. He offered it to Britain. He is understood to have approached the Soviet Union and received a payment from Amtorg, the Soviet trading organization, for related work. No government built it. No prototype has ever been found. And in 1934, the year he announced a weapon that would abolish war, the Westinghouse Corporation quietly put Nikola Tesla on its payroll as a consulting engineer. The company was not buying his expertise. Internal correspondence makes the motive clear. It would be highly embarrassing if it became publicly known that Tesla was penniless. The salary was $125 a month, and they also covered his hotel bill. The man whose patents built the company was being paid a pension by it, disguised as a job, to prevent a scandal. He accepted. He had no alternative. He was 78, and he lived on that arrangement for the last 9 years of his life. In 1937, walking to feed the pigeons, he was struck by a taxi and badly injured. He refused to see a doctor. He had always distrusted them and never fully recovered. He grew thinner. He stopped going out. In his last years, he weighed under 50 kilograms. He continued to hold the birthday interviews, and in the first week of January 1943, he hung a sign on the door of room 3327, asking not to be disturbed. He died sometime during the night of the 7th of January 1943, alone, of coronary thrombosis. He was 86. The maid found him the following morning. What happened next, you already know, because we began there. But now, the details land differently. Within hours, the Office of Alien Property Custodian moved, and Walter Gorsuch seized everything in the bedroom and the adjoining storeroom, 2 truckloads of material, and took it to the Manhattan Storage Company, where 80 barrels and bundles that Tesla had deposited a decade earlier were already sitting, held against unpaid bills. The legal reasoning was that Tesla's heir, his nephew, Sava Kosanovich, was a foreign national. The actual reasoning was the death beam, and a war, and a rumor that German agents were looking for it. Then, the government needed someone to tell them what they had. They called in a young MIT professor named John G. Trump, an expert in high-voltage generators, then working on radar at the radiation laboratory, and, as it happens, the uncle of a future American president. Trump spent 3 days examining the papers. His report, filed on the 30th of January 1943, is the closest thing to a final verdict that exists on Nikola Tesla. It is my considered opinion that there exist among Dr. Tesla's papers and possessions No scientific notes, descriptions of hitherto unrevealed methods or devices, or actual apparatus which could be of significant value to this country or which constitute a hazard in unfriendly hands. Trump elaborated. Tesla's work for at least the previous 15 years, he wrote, had been primarily speculative, philosophical, and somewhat promotional in character, often concerned with the wireless transmission of power, but containing no sound workable principles or methods for achieving it. There was no death ray. There were no suppressed secrets. There was an old man's accumulated paper, and inside it, the record of a mind that had gone on generating grand systems long after it had stopped being able to build them. The property was released to his nephew. Most of it eventually went to Belgrade, where it remains in the Nikola Tesla Museum. 2,000 people attended the funeral at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Messages were read from 3 Nobel laureates. They described him as one of the outstanding intellects of the world, a man who paved the way for many of the technological developments of his time. He was cremated. His ashes are in Belgrade, in a gold-plated sphere, a shape he had disliked all his life. 5 months later, in June 1943, the United States Supreme Court ruled on the priority of radio patents. The decision upheld Tesla's patents over Marconi's in key respects. He had been dead for 5 months. The ruling is often described as vindication. It was, in practice, a matter of patent law involving wartime damage claims. He received nothing from it. He was not alive to receive anything. So what do we do with him? The mythology says, a genius who invented the modern world, robbed by Edison, crushed by Morgan, whose free energy was suppressed by capital, and whose secrets were seized by the government. Almost every element of that is either false or, importantly, distorted. Edison employed him and made him credible. Morgan funded him and stopped when the project turned out to be something other than what he had bought. Free wireless power has never worked for anyone. The seized papers contained nothing of value and were returned. But the deflation of the myth does not produce a smaller man. It produces a stranger one. Here is what is actually true. The polyphase alternating current system is his. It is running underneath this recording, in the wall behind you, in every building of every city in the industrialized world. It has been running continuously for over a century. Almost nothing else invented in the 1880s is still in use in its original form. He arrived at it by closing his eyes and watching a machine that did not exist, in a mind that had been producing uncontrollable images since he was a child of 7 who had watched his brother die. He converted an affliction into an instrument, and with it, he electrified the planet. And the same instrument, indistinguishable from the inside, later showed him a tower that would deliver free power to every human being on Earth, and he believed it with exactly the same certainty, and it destroyed him. He could not tell the visions apart. That is not a flaw in his character, that is the deal. He died owing money for the room he died in. 3327, divisible by 3. And a young lawyer who had never heard his name picked up a telephone, called the Westinghouse Corporation to ask who this man had been, and was told, without Tesla, there would have been no Westinghouse.